Imagine an elderly veteran dismissed as a nuisance, pushed out of a museum until a general's voice changes everything. What secret does his old patch hold? Stay tuned to find out on Graceful Valor Stories. He didn't say a word when they called him a nuisance. Didn't fight back when the guard grabbed his arm. He just adjusted his sleeve, revealing an old patch, faded but intact. 101st Airborne. That's when a voice stopped the room cold. Where did you get that? The general wasn't asking. He was remembering. If you think their stories deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe and comment on or below. The museum doors hissed shut behind him. Frank Mercer stood just inside the lobby, shaking off the cold. He wore a pressed flannel, sturdy jeans, and an old brown field jacket, the kind that had seen more than one war zone, faded on the shoulder, a 101st Airborne patch, nearly threadbare. He didn't walk fast, didn't carry a phone. He just nodded politely to the front desk clerk, a boy young enough to be his grandson, and made his way toward the exhibit hallway, cane tapping lightly with each step. "Excuse me, sir," the clerk called after him. Frank turned steady. "We actually require timed entry tickets now. Do you have one?" "No," Frank said, voice calm. "I've been coming here every Veterans Week since they opened. Just wanted to sit a while quietly." The kid hesitated, then tapped something on his screen. Another staff member leaned over and whispered too low to hear, but her face said enough. "He's just here to loiter again." Frank made his way toward the end of the Hall of Honor, where a long wooden bench faced the memorial wall. Names were etched in black glass, thousands of them. He lowered himself down slowly, resting both hands on the head of his cane. He didn't speak, didn't take out a camera, just stared at the names. The clerk was watching. He leaned into his radio. Moments later, a young security guard appeared from the rear corridor, shoulders squared, jaw tight, like he had something to prove. He walked straight toward Frank. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the museum." Frank blinked up at him. "Why?" The guard glanced toward the desk, then back. "You've been reported for loitering. We've had complaints." Frank stood slowly. His knees crackled. He didn't argue. He just nodded and adjusted the sleeve on his jacket, revealing the worn eagle patch. The guard reached out to guide him a little too firm on the elbow. But before Frank took his next step, a voice from behind them broke the room like glass. "Hold it!" The guard froze. Frank turned slowly. At the entrance stood a man in full dress uniform, chest full of ribbons, shoulders squared, silver eagles on his collar. A general. He didn't say another word. He just stared at Frank's patch like he'd seen a ghost. From a quiet museum bench to a hero's recognition, all because of a patch that stopped a general in his tracks. Discover the full story on Graceful Valor Stories. Most days, Frank Mercer moved through the world like wallpaper. At 76, he wasn't what you'd call frail, but life had settled into a quiet routine. Wake at dawn, brew strong black coffee in the same dented kettle he'd used for 30 years. Then a slow walk down Oak Street to the park, one step at a time. He liked the benches under the elm trees, especially the one near the old war statue. No plaque, just a soldier looking over his shoulder. Frank never wore his medals. Didn't talk about Vietnam unless someone asked, and no one really asked anymore. At the corner diner, the waitress Sandy always brought him the same thing. Dry toast, scrambled eggs, no salt. She never called him sir, just Mr. Mercer, which he liked. It meant she still saw him. Back at his apartment, the walls were clean but bare. No TV, just books, a radio, and a box in the closet he hadn't touched in years. Inside that box were his Bronze Star, a few unit photographs, and a letter he never mailed, addressed to a soldier who didn't make it home. Every now and then, Frank would take out a photo of 3 young men standing on a jungle trail, shirts unbuttoned, arms slung around each other, grinning like the world hadn't yet hardened them. One of them was Tom Garrison, the other was Frank. They had gone through fire together, and somehow Frank came back alone. For years he kept up with Tom's family, sent cards, even visited once, but people move. Numbers change, and eventually silence sets in. Still, once a year, Frank made the trip to the memorial at the museum. Not for the ceremony, not for speeches, just to sit, just to remember. This time the staff didn't recognize him. Maybe they never had. He wasn't loud. He didn't wear a uniform. He just looked like another old man in a jacket too warm for fall. And so, in a place built to remember, they tried to make him invisible. But someone else remembered, someone who had waited a long time for this moment, and he had stars on his shoulders. The young guard dropped his hand. Frank turned slowly to see the man standing in the entryway, tall, composed, with steel gray hair and eyes that locked onto his jacket like it was more than fabric. The general stepped forward, ignoring the staff completely. "You're Frank Mercer, aren't you?" Frank looked him over. The voice was familiar, but the years had drawn a veil. "I am," Frank said, cautious. "And you are?" The general's lips curved into something between a smile and a salute. "Thomas Garrison. My father was Captain Tom Garrison." Frank's eyes flickered. He remembered now a boy in a family photo. Bright-eyed, held by a man Frank once pulled out of a collapsing bunker. Frank's voice was quieter than before. "You're his son." The general nodded. "My father used to tell a story about a mechanic with a busted knee who carried him half a mile under fire. Said he owed his life to a man who never waited for orders, just got it done." Frank chuckled once softly. "He always did exaggerate." "No," the general said firmly. "He didn't." Everyone in the lobby had fallen still. Even the front desk clerk was now listening, face pale. The general turned to the guard, who was still standing awkwardly nearby. "You put your hands on a man whose service patch predates your birth. You need to think carefully about how you treat the ones who came before you." The guard looked like he might melt into the floor. He nodded once, muttered, "I'm sorry, sir." But it wasn't clear who he was speaking to. Frank waved it off. Let the boy be. He didn't know. "That's the problem," the general said. "Too many don't." He turned back to Frank. "Would you come with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Frank hesitated, then nodded. The two men walked side by side down the Hall of Honor. No one stopped them. No one dared. As they passed the bench where Frank had tried to sit earlier, the general paused. He gestured to the names on the wall. "You belong here more than any plaque we've ever printed." Frank didn't respond, but for the first time all day, he smiled. Just a little. By that evening, the museum's front office had made more phone calls than they had all month. The general had spoken to the director personally, firmly, respectfully, but without leaving room for excuses. "No press releases," he said. "Not yet. Start by fixing what you broke." That night, Frank went home the same way he always did. Slow steps, cane tapping the sidewalk. But something had shifted. People noticed him. Outside the diner, Sandy waved without being prompted. "Your usual tomorrow, Mr. Mercer." Frank gave a small nod, looking forward to it. At home, he turned on his old lamp and sat near the window. He hadn't had company in weeks. Then came the knock. It was quiet, just 2 taps. Frank opened the door to find a young man in a faded navy sweatshirt holding a newspaper clipping. "Are you the same Frank Mercer in this article?" he asked. Frank narrowed his eyes. "What article?" The young man handed it over. It was a photo from 1972. Frank, younger, stronger, smeared in dust, standing beside an armored transport. The headline read, "Local mechanic saved 6 in seated tunnel collapse. Bronze Star awarded." "I found this in my grandfather's collection." The man said, "He said you once rebuilt an engine under fire. Got them all home. That was your squad, wasn't it?" Frank ran a finger over the photo. "I suppose it was," he said. The man nodded. "Thank you, sir." He didn't linger, just turned and walked away. Frank closed the door gently behind him. A forgotten hero finds his place again. Watch how a town's recognition transforms Frank's life on Graceful Valor Stories. The next morning, a small handwritten sign appeared outside the museum. To Sergeant Mercer, we apologize. Your seat is reserved. And on the bench where he'd been pushed away the day before, a folded card sat beneath the morning sun. On the front, welcome back. Inside, just 2 words written by hand. We remember. And suddenly Frank Mercer wasn't just a name in an old file. He was a man the town had seen again and could no longer forget. The museum didn't make a grand announcement. No speeches, no cameras. But the following Monday, a folded letter arrived in Frank's mailbox. Thick stock, handwritten envelope. At the top corner, Mabel Lum, Director, Veterans Heritage Museum. Inside a single page, Mr. Mercer, we failed to recognize. Not just your service, but your presence. Our staff acted without knowledge and without respect. That is our burden to fix. You are welcome here anytime. No ticket required. We'd like to host a small gathering in your honor. If not for ceremony, then simply to say we remember. With respect, Mabel Lum. Frank stared at the letter a long while. He folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. Didn't smile, didn't sigh, just nodded like he'd been waiting for someone to get it right for a long time. That Friday, the general returned. No full uniform this time, just a pressed jacket and a quiet presence. He joined Frank for coffee at the diner. They spoke like old friends, even though they barely were. I looked up the name, the general said. Corporal Ellis, my father, wrote about him in one of his old journals. Said he owed his life to a mechanic who didn't wait for orders. Frank stirred his coffee. Ellis was brave. That tunnel wouldn't have held if he hadn't propped the beam while I worked. I was just the wrench guy. That wrench guy, the general said, held up half a squad with a busted jack and a bent axle. My father never forgot it. Frank didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Later that evening, the bench at the museum was no longer just a bench. Someone had left a small wooden plaque beneath it, reserved. Franklin Mercer, 101st Airborne, still standing. Visitors took notice. Some paused. A few older veterans saluted the space even when Frank wasn't there. The young security guard, the one who had once grabbed his elbow, returned one afternoon. He didn't make a scene. Just approached quietly, cap in hand. I was wrong, sir. He said, I read about you. I didn't see it then. Frank nodded not unkindly. I didn't expect you to. Just try to see the next one. The guard swallowed hard and walked away. Justice didn't roar. It just landed gently, right where it was owed. It started as a quiet idea, just a small gathering, the museum director said. No announcements, no microphones, just a few people who cared enough to come. But word travels differently in small towns, especially when you whisper something worth hearing. By Sunday morning, folding chairs filled the front lawn of the Veterans Heritage Museum. No banners, just a single flag at full height waving against a soft autumn breeze. Frank didn't want to sit in the front row, but the general insisted. You earned the chair before half of us were born, he'd said. You're not hiding in the back today. Frank wore the same brown jacket, but this time the patch on his shoulder had been restitched, cleaned, pressed, upright. People he hadn't spoken to in years showed up. A woman from the diner brought a warm apple pie in a tin wrapped with string. A boy from the high school newspaper took photos with care, not for likes, but for memory. There were no long speeches, no background music, only the sound of wind and footsteps as the general stepped forward and faced the small crowd. He didn't look at his notes. Some men leave footprints you don't see until they're nearly gone, he said. They don't ask for recognition. They don't expect applause. They just show up over and over. He turned to Frank, voice steady. When others ran, you stayed. When others waited, you moved. When this town forgot, you returned anyway. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a box, small, dark blue, worn at the edges. Inside is service medallion engraved with one phrase, "For quiet valor that still speaks." Frank didn't say anything. He just stood slow with a soft ease in his knees and accepted the medal with both hands. A few in the crowd rose to their feet. Then more, and finally everyone. No one clapped. No one cheered. They just stood with him. Because some moments don't need volume, they just need to be seen. The next week, the bench at the museum never stayed empty for long. Sometimes Frank sat there with his coffee. Other times, a student would take notes beside it for a school paper. A woman left flowers once, small white lilies in a mason jar. No name, no card. At the diner, they didn't charge him anymore. Didn't make a fuss either. Sandy just poured the coffee, set down his plate and gave a nod. "You were always good to us," she said once. "We just forgot to say it." He nodded back, quiet. "That's all right. You're saying it now." Later that month, Frank was invited to speak at the local high school's Veterans Day assembly. He declined at first, said he wasn't one for speeches, but the principal sent a handwritten note signed by 20 students. "We don't want a hero. We want to hear from someone real." That part stuck with him. So, he stood behind the podium that Friday morning in front of 300 students and staff. No slideshow, no microphone feedback. Just him and a piece of folded paper he never read from. "I've been called a few things," Frank said. "Mechanic, sergeant, husband, nuisance." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "But names don't matter as much as showing up. I just kept showing up even when no one noticed." There was a stillness in the room. "I don't need applause. I never did. I just wanted to know the things I gave were worth something." He looked out at the rows of students, some leaning forward, some blinking harder than they expected. If someone in your life shows up for you quietly, daily without needing thanks, notice them. That's service, too. When he finished, no one stood. No one clapped too soon. They just took it in. And that's exactly what Frank wanted, not to be celebrated, just to be seen and remembered for who he really was. It was almost winter when the porch light outside Frank's apartment stopped burning out. He replaced the bulb himself, standing on the second rung of an old wooden stool, muttering about cheap wiring and cold fingers, but the light stayed on after that, every night, without fail. Not because he was waiting for anyone, but because somehow people had started to come by. Sandy from the diner brought a pie once a week. The museum director stopped in with a history student who just wanted to ask what jungle humidity felt like. Even the young security guard came back one evening. He brought his father, a retired Air Force medic, who shook Frank's hand like it was a ritual. They didn't talk long. They didn't need to. On the living room shelf sat the medal the general had given him, and beside it the old photo of 3 grinning soldiers. Frank had placed a sticky note on the back. "Still here, still grateful." That night, as the snow began to dust the sidewalks, Frank sat out on his porch, flannel collar up, mug warm in his hands, porch light glowing above him like a quiet flag. Across the street, a boy on a bicycle skidded to a stop. He waved. "Hi, Mr. Frank. My teacher read your story in class." Frank gave a small wave back. "She said you weren't loud like the other veterans," the boy added. "But that you still mattered." Frank smiled. "She's a smart one." The boy nodded, then took off down the street, tires squealing as he disappeared around the corner. Frank leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked beneath him, but it held just like he always had. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a problem to move or a nuisance to clear. He just felt home. If you believe quiet dignity still deserves a place in this world, subscribe and comment honor below to keep their stories remembered on Graceful Valor Stories.